Thank you so much to Magers and Quinn for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. So for me, this store is really home base. When I moved to Minneapolis, I made the brilliant choice to move into a building that is around the corner from this store. And so the store has done a lot of damage to my wallet, a lot of good for my heart. I wouldn't do this launch anywhere else. So huge thanks to Annie and everyone here for having me. And thank you so much to all of you for coming. There's so many people here in the audience who are supportive thank you, in the long project of writing this book. And I am very grateful for that. And thankful to all of you for coming out on an icy evening. I did get a text from a pal on the way here saying, my car is stuck, I've canceled my RSVP, I hope someone else can come. And so I know that you may have battled with your yak tracks and your shovels, and I'm grateful. So I'm gonna read just from the beginning of Brotherless Night. And it's in the first person from the point of view of a woman recalling her teenage years in Sri Lanka, and she's speaking from New York in 2009, and she's remembering a story that begins basically in 1981 in Sri Lanka, so it's retrospective and in the first person. I recently sent a letter to a terrorist I used to know. He lives near me, here in New York City. And when I opened the envelope and slid in the note that said, I would like to come and see you, I thought of how much he had always required of me and how little I had ever asked of him. Even when I was growing up in Sri Lanka, before I had ever heard the word terrorist, I knew that if a certain kind of person wanted something done, I should comply without asking too many questions. I met a lot of these sorts of people when I was younger because I used to be what you would call a terrorist myself. We were civilians first. You must understand that word, terrorist, is too simple for the history we have lived. Too simple for me, too simple even for this man. How could one word be enough? But I am going to say it anyway because it is the language you know, and it will help you to understand who we were, what we were called, and who we have truly become. We begin with this word, but I promise that you will come to see that it cannot contain everything that has happened. Someday the story will begin with the word civilian, the word home. And while I am no longer the version of myself who met with terrorists every day, I also want you to understand that when I was that woman, when two terrorists encountered each other, in my world, what they said first was simply hello, like any two people you might know or love. Part 1, a near invisible scar. Chapter 1, the boys with the Jaffna eyes. Jaffna, 1981. I met the first terrorist I knew when he was deciding to become one. Kay and his family lived down the road from me and mine in one village of the Tamil town called Jaffna in Sri Lanka. The Jaffna Peninsula is the northernmost part of the country. Many people have died there, some killed by the Sri Lankan army in the state, some by the Indian peacekeeping force, and some by the Tamil separatists, whom you know as the terrorists. Many people, of course, have also lived. In early 1981, I was almost 16 years old. I already wanted to become a doctor like my grandfather, and I had recently begun attending my brother's school, where girls my age were accepted for advanced level studies. In those days, I thought mostly about the university entrance exams. Kay, too, dreamed of medical school. And this was what made us alike, long before Kay chose the movement, long before I treated patients in a New York City emergency room, long before we became so different. Kay had the upper hand from the first, not because he was 1 year older, or a boy, but because I was his patient. Our meeting was both gruesome and fortunate for me. On the day that we met, I was boiling water for tea. I had to use a piece of cloth to hold the pot's metal handle. But that morning, the cloth slipped, the handle slipped, and the pot slipped, pouring scalding water all over me. I screamed and screamed for my mother, Amma! My shrill voice carried out onto the road where Kay was passing. Letting his bicycle fall in the dirt at our gate, he ran inside. By the time he reached me in the kitchen at the back of the house, Amma had already found me. As bubbles rose and popped on my skin, I shut my eyes, but I could hear her sobbing and the sounds of pots and pans clattering to the floor. With every clang, heat flared around and inside me. Under my skin, another skin burned. I cried and called for Muruhan, Pulair, Shiva. Sashi, he said, and I opened my eyes to his face without recognizing it. Sit, he said, and pointed to a chair. When I kept screaming but did not move, he grabbed my hands, pushed me down into the chair, and peeled my blouse up, baring my scorched stomach. I heard Amma's ayo beside me, as though she were speaking from a great distance. Snatching a bowl of eggs off the table, Kay began cracking them onto the wounds. I have to fetch water, Amma said. Clutching a pan, she tried to move past him. But he put his shoulders between her and the doorway. This will cool the burn, he said. She stood there uselessly. I stared at him, trying to focus on anything but the pain, and saw only his thumbs working in and out of the eggshells, scraping the slime of the whites cleanly onto the swelling rawness. He did it very swiftly, as though he had had a lot of practice, as though every scrap of egg was precious. My skin was so hot that even now, when I remember those quick and clever hands and the slippery shock of relief, I cannot quite believe that the eggs did not just cook on my flesh. When the last one was cracked and steaming on my skin, Kay looked up at Amma. Are there more? She did not respond, still stunned. More eggs, he said. She blinked, then nodded. Good, keep covering the burn. I'll go for the doctor. When Kay returned with the physician half an hour later, the older man looked over the makeshift dressing with approval. It should heal, he said. You may not even have a scar. My own mother used to crack eggs onto burns. This is not the kind of medicine they teach in school. Whose idea was it? Kay glanced at me without saying anything. I crackled inside still. I didn't know what to do, Amma said softly. His idea, I said. So I began as Kay's patient, though he ended as mine. I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you, Sugi, for reading that. And I have to say, since I'm one of the only two people who has a microphone right now, I have to say congratulations. This is, I know, obviously there's so many people here who love you and are so excited about this book, which is an amazing literary achievement. And I think probably, a lot of people here have read the book and a lot of people haven't, but it's so, when I first read it, I just had that feeling of, sort of the double thrill of like, oh my God, this is such a rich, intelligent, epic, ambitious book, and like, my friend did this, and just feeling like it's really great to feel so like proud and impressed by your friends. But okay, so there's so much for us to discuss tonight, and you all will also have the opportunity to ask questions. But I know one thing that I think about a lot is, and we were just talking upstairs. So you started this book, and I know we'll talk about the sort of almost like logistical element of this and the writing element, but you started it in January 2004, 19 years ago, which I will say it shows. Like, I think in the best possible. It feels like a book that was like, someone worked really hard to produce this. But I'm curious, given the time that's passed, is the book that we're both holding now the book that you conceived of back then, or did it change over time?
Thanks for that question. And I should also say I'm very fortunate that you did read an early draft of it, because the very first sentence changed because of something you said to me, which I'm so grateful to have been in conversation with you about this, and to be in conversation with you here. And I will say I'm toting around my bag so that I can say Curtis's forthcoming novel is really, really great. I read it. It's amazing. I tore through it. I can't wait for you to get your hands on it. Okay. Conference. Anyway. So 19 years ago, when I was 23, I don't think I really had a sense of what the whole book would look like. I would just sort of march forward in mild terror and huge excitement from page to page. Very interested in the history, but with really no idea what the arc of the book would look like at all. And of course, as you just heard, the prologue of the book is in New York in 2009, and that's the year that the war ended. And so I started the book before the war ended, so certainly I could not have imagined this shape for it. And there are, characters who perished and were born in that time, characters who were fused, and all sorts of things that I didn't anticipate. There were huge chunks in New York, and I've talked about this a little bit with some folks here, but there was like a lot of very snappy action in New York. I lived in New York from 2006 to 2009, and I think I had kind of like a Sex and the City, His Girl Friday kind of like dream that should not have been connected to this at all. And maybe someday I'll return to it, but it's not in these pages, don't worry. So I discarded a lot of pages. There's probably at least 2 other not very good novels that went down.
And are you an outliner at all, or even like a retroactive outliner?
I am a retroactive outliner. And when I finished a draft that I was happy with, I went back and I tried to do a list of every action that every character took that meant anything, and it started to read to me like a soap opera episode summary. And so I got through like maybe 4 chapters and I was like, I'm good. But I think history and thinking about writing it in order was eventually the thing that helped me to finish it. Another mutual friend of ours, Leslie Arima, also a fantastic writer, had encouraged me at some point to think about how I used time and maybe to try writing my book in order, and that was key.
So before she encouraged you to do that, it was not in chronological order?
No. Sri Lankan history, some of you here are very familiar with Sri Lankan history, and it is very dense, and I think I just didn't want to get into it. Because then it's a lot of dealing with cause and effect and kind of a density of history probably that I was a little bit afraid of. And so I was maybe trying to avoid it by always talking about, what would happen, but the characters didn't know it yet. And like, the horrible future that awaited them, or like the great thing that would happen, they had no idea. So they were always before and after and never during. And her comment really helped me to get around that.
So in terms of research, this is sort of a 2-pronged question. Like, what sort of research did you do? And did you do it ahead of time, or were you sort of writing and researching simultaneously?
I started the book because of a small piece of history that I was very interested in that didn't fit into my first novel. And I knew it didn't. And I also knew that I didn't know what to do with the draft of my first novel. So I kind of put that away and went to work on this. And so I did have that little bit, and then I would sort of research and write at the same time.
And what was that specifically?
It was, there's a hunger strike in the book, and that was really kind of the first bit of research that I found that really interested me, because it was about political theater, essentially, and how that was staged, and who was meant to think what because of it.
And so, okay, so you knew you wanted to write about that or to include that, and then as you wrote over all these years, were you, was it like a year of research, a year of writing, or were you just continuously doing both?
That's a good question. I guess mostly I was doing both, and then there were some stretches where I would just do the research. And research can also, research is really fun and interesting. It can be a form of procrastination. I'm sure no one here knows what I'm talking about. And so I'm sure there was, some of that going on too. And then I was fortunate that over the years, there were also moments when just for an occasion, for a reading, I would want to write something new. And sometimes when I did that, those would actually end up in the book. So some of the sections of the book that I think are the strongest were written actually for readings.
That's actually super interesting. What forms did your research take? Like, were you interviewing people, or were you, reading, or I don't know, talking to relatives, or things like that?
A lot of it was reading. I spent a lot of time in university libraries, and also just in Sri Lanka. I would buy books and bring them back and look at them. And so a lot of it was just pure academic history. And then some of it was interviewing. And those two things worked much better together because it was easier to fit personal stories into that larger historical narrative if I kind of had the historical chops to understand what else might have been going on at the same time that someone was talking about. So I'm fortunate to be friends with a lot of people in the social sciences, and specifically anthropologists. And anthropologists have comprehensive exams, and they have to really know their history. And so some of my friends were in graduate school and working in Sri Lanka at the same time that I was working on this book, and they knew their history really, really well. And so I was sort of constantly surrounded by these examples of people who were also, maybe not raised in Sri Lanka, but who had put their minds to learning the history and had done it, and who were generous with their time and checking me on, did I know all of my stuff? And they just were a really good example. So I appreciated that a lot. Some of them are here.
Do you feel that the book is, for anyone in particular, and especially, is it more for people who maybe have familiarity with Sri Lanka and with the Civil War, or the opposite, or is it like the more the merrier?
What writer would not say the word merrier, right? Thank you all for being here. Certainly, people who are familiar with the history will see a lot of things in the book that others may not see. But I don't think that someone who doesn't know the history will read it and feel that they're being excluded, or at least I hope not. And the book also has a slightly fraught, the narration has a fraught relationship to the idea of explanation. Who is explaining things to you? Who are you that you are asking for an explanation? Who am I presuming that you are? And there's a little bit of crankiness in the narration around that. So Sashi, the narrator, at various points addresses the reader directly. Sometimes she's assuming things about who is listening. Sometimes she wonders if she's wrong. Sometimes she resents that she's being asked to explain things. She generally explains them anyway. So there is kind of like there's a little bit of debate going on there about who gets to tell the story and who is assumed to be listening to it.
Actually, I'm glad you brought this up because I think it's very interesting. Like there'll be these sentences that are like, I want you to understand. And do you have a specific idea of who is the you a specific person or a collective person?
I guess it's the people reading the book.
So it's anyone,
yeah.
Potentially.
I mean, back in sort of snappy Sex and the City Girl Friday land, she was talking to a specific person, and then I realized I didn't care about that person, so I whacked them. And then I realized that I was left with this really marvelously flexible thing that was handy in a way that I hadn't anticipated, so I went with that.
That is, sort of fascinating. So it was more like you didn't decide ahead of time to have her talk to the reader. It was more like this residual thing, that you just kept.
Well, there was the you on the page. So I read that prologue. That prologue has been there since very early days of the book, and that has the you in it. And then I think at some point I was like, maybe that's a specific you, and then I tried that for a long time and it didn't work. And then I kind of went back to the way it had been, and that seemed to work much better. But yeah, I mean, I think it used to be a specific person who had the power to kind of take action and to react to her in certain ways. And my own interest in that character like could not sustain that interaction. I just wanted to listen to her. So, but that you was on the page in one form or another from pretty early on. Along with that, I want you to understand.
Okay, so I want to talk about the 19-year gestation period of this book from a sort of psychological perspective. Did you always know that you would finish, or that's actually a bit sincere question. Partly I'm curious because I think that this is something that a lot of other people could kind of take inspiration from, and if you had moments of feeling like, and partly again, like I think it's sometimes there are books out there that it almost feels like the person like wrote them while watching TV or something, and this is like the opposite of that, where it's like it feels meticulous, but then it's also a really great read, and that takes a long time. So did you know? I mean, you can if this is your event, so you cannot answer any questions. But did you always did you ever give up and go back to it, or did you
I never gave up with the notion that I wouldn't go back to it. I never thought I should totally trash this. That never happened. There were definitely moments when I put it away. I started writing this book in 2004. I published my first novel in 2008, and it's not this book. So, and I think that each book helped me to work on the other one and taught me certain skills that were useful in the writing of the other book. So a little bit of having multiple pots on the stove was useful, and I think is probably something I'll go back to doing. But yeah, I think just out of sheer stubbornness, would I call it knowing? Probably not. I don't think I knew I would finish, but I also knew that I wouldn't stop, which is potentially a kind of foolishness in certain situations. But I think in this case, I just was sort of like not going to. I had said that I would, so I was going to, in one form or another. And I was fortunate also to have around me people who thought that I would finish, despite the fact that it was taking that long, which is nice. And I think that a lot of people when you are working on a project like that, if people know that you're doing it or don't know that you're doing it, that can help or hurt in different ways. But to have the people who sort of are like, oh, of course you're working on your novel, and of course you'll finish it. Those people are great.
So if there's a person, and especially someone who, maybe is holding down at least one other non-writing relating job, and has been writing a novel for like 8 or 9 years or something, and maybe, I don't know, do you have any advice for that? Like, is it sort of on how to kind of maintain faith in yourself, even if it's not going very quickly?
Sure. I think to surround yourself with the people who think that you'll finish, and ignore all others. Politely, but just sort of, you don't have to entertain everyone's opinions about your creative life. And in fact, maybe when you're in the middle of that 8 or 9 years, you probably shouldn't, because it can be kind of, I think one of the dangers of 19 years is there are like a lot of people in my acknowledgements, which is great. I feel extremely fortunate about that. But there can also be, as with anything that is kind of like a young and tender project, there can be like the danger of too many cooks, too many opinions. And so selecting what matters to you and who you'll listen to, and also the moments when you don't show it to anyone, seem like they're really important.
Okay, so this is sort of an unrelated question. Obviously, we're in a wonderful independent bookstore. I know there are sort of, for the audiobook, there's kind of a special reader or special circumstances. So if you want to read your physical copy while also listening, this is what you might have in store.
So I read in Northfield last week at Content, I think it was the day after the audiobook had come out, and I had just been listening to it I kind of thought, I can maybe never read from my own book again, because the audiobook is read by someone who Sashi should have like a Sri Lankan English accent, right? So she should sound like, she doesn't sound like me. And so she does sound like the audiobook narrator. So if you have a chance to, you know, click on the audiobook sample or listen to the audiobook, I am fairly new to audiobooks myself. I'm pretty over the moon that this person agreed to read the audiobook.